Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. I have always taken pride in being someone who reads every line of a property contract and researches every corner of a neighborhood before buying real estate. Yet, even the most diligent person can find themselves in an astonishingly complicated situation if someone else decides to bend the rules. When I moved to my quiet piece of land just outside a well-developed residential area several years ago, I believed I had thought of every possible conflict. I'd checked for zoning discrepancies, researched local history, and talked to anyone who would spare a moment to discuss the surroundings. The entire reason I chose this little spot was because it was private, overlooked a beautiful pond that extended into a small wooded area, and was not governed by any homeowners association. I wanted to enjoy my freedom without monthly dues or random fines popping up in my mailbox. When I purchased this property, the first thing I did was confirm that the pond was entirely within my boundaries. It was, indeed, my private pond. I wasn't required to share it with any municipality or association, and I reveled in the idea that I could stock it with fish, spend quiet mornings on the small dock that was already there, and generally enjoy nature without interruption. Knowing that many neighborhoods nearby were managed by homeowners associations, HOAs, with strict rules, I felt relieved that my little oasis fell outside their grasp. My agent confirmed it. "They're not your HOA," she said. "You don't have to worry about them demanding anything." And for several years, that was the status quo. I lived peacefully, occasionally hearing about neighborhood spats in the wider area. Disputes over lawn decorations, the color of shingles, or what brand of mailbox was permitted. None of that impacted me. I believed I was free from the entire ordeal. However, that relative calm began to erode about a year after I moved in, when the neighboring development decided to expand. At first, I received a polite letter in the mail from some association official who wanted to introduce themselves. The letter suggested they wanted to build a sense of community, but since I was not a member of their association, I discarded it. After all, it didn't pertain to me. About 6 months later, I noticed unusual activity near my pond. I often took early morning walks around my land before heading to work. One day, I spotted several people in bright reflective vests, surveying poles in hand, pointing toward the water's edge. As I came closer, one of them waved me over. "We're mapping out a project for the homeowners association next door," a cheerful man explained. "They're considering a new walking trail that might run along the boundary near this body of water." He spoke as if I should be delighted to hear such news. I remember asking him why they were surveying my property. He squinted at his notes and assured me that the markers for the boundary had been determined by some official documents. I told him, politely but firmly, that the pond was mine, including a small area of land that extended around it. He nodded in a vaguely confused manner, said he would relay my concerns, and left. At that point, I should have followed up with the county clerk or had a legal consult just to reaffirm the boundaries, but I didn't feel a pressing need to do so. I believed a brief chat with the survey team would suffice to prevent any encroachment. I had all the documents proving the pond was mine. If they had questions, they could come ask. A few weeks later, I was blindsided. I woke up one morning to the drone of heavy machinery coming from the far edge of my pond. Startled, I threw on a jacket and boots, trying to make sense of the commotion. As I approached the water, I saw workers in construction helmets cutting brush, dragging planks, and measuring distances. They had wooden frames lying on the ground, some type of foundation for a small structure. I approached them cautiously and asked what they were doing. One worker, a younger fellow, informed me that they were building a small footbridge and walkway for the local homeowners association. "It's all part of a new plan," he explained. "We have a timeline, and we're supposed to finish this before the next community event." I could hardly believe my ears. There was no permission granted from my side, no discussion, no agreement. They were building a bridge across my private pond. I reaffirmed to the worker that I was not part of that association. My property was independent, and I certainly had not authorized any construction. He just shrugged and said he was only following instructions from the project manager. My frustration soared, and I demanded to speak to someone in charge. A site supervisor came over with a clipboard in hand. He had a friendly enough demeanor, but I could see in his eyes the sign of trouble. He truly believed they had the right to be there. The supervisor claimed the homeowners association had an easement that allowed them to use part of the pond's perimeter for community developments. I was nearly speechless. This man was telling me they had every right to do what they were doing. I told him that was impossible, as I had meticulously researched my property lines. There was no mention of any easement in my deed or in any of the purchase documents. He insisted that they had official approval and said their association had a copy of some old agreement from a previous owner of my property many years ago. I left to dig up my records, trying to verify if what he said could possibly be true. For days, I pored over the papers I had gathered when I bought the land, the maps, the boundary surveys, the property deed, and I found nothing referencing an easement. I contacted my real estate agent, who was as flummoxed as I was. Meanwhile, the construction continued. I watched a footbridge begin to take shape, arcing across the narrowest portion of the pond. Outraged, I spoke with a local attorney for a quick consultation. She recommended I file a cease and desist letter and demand an immediate halt to the construction until the matter could be clarified. So I did exactly that. The letter was sent to the Homeowners Association Board, but their response was both swift and dismissive. They claimed that an easement existed from many decades prior, and they would not stop the project. They attached a photocopy of a handwritten agreement that was barely legible. The name of the alleged signer was someone I had never heard of. The year indicated was more than 70 years ago. My attorney said that if I suspected the document was invalid, I could challenge it in court, but that would be a long process. It might not halt the construction in time to prevent them from completing the project. I felt cornered. While I tried to gather all the evidence, the builders continued. In the span of a month, a small wooden footbridge stood across my pond, lined with railings and a sign that read, "Community Crossing, Residents Only." The association even installed decorative lighting along the path, and they put up a posted schedule for community events that would be hosted on the other side, using a scenic walkway. I stood there in disbelief, watching random folks from the neighboring development stroll onto my land, crossing a structure I never permitted and heading towards some nature trail that connected with the far side of my property. To make matters worse, I started receiving complaints from these neighbors about the condition of their new walkway. They knocked on my door, politely but firmly stating that the brush near the footbridge needed clearing or that the slope by the water was too muddy. When I told them they were trespassing on private land, they said their board had told them it was now association territory. It was maddening. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I hired a reputable law firm that specialized in real estate disputes. They examined the archaic document the HOA was relying on and deemed it deeply suspect. One section contained references to property markers that no longer existed, and the signature didn't match up with any known previous owner. Additionally, there was a statement about communal use of farmland, which made no sense in reference to my pond. The attorneys believed there was a solid case against the association for trespassing and unauthorized construction. However, they told me the cost of going to court could be high, and we had to be sure we could recoup those expenses. We wanted to lay out all the damages and figure out an amount that would also serve as a deterrent. That's how we arrived at the sum of $496,000. The attorneys believed that not only had the association trespassed, but they had significantly impacted my property value by building a structure without proper authorization. Moreover, the new traffic across my land had potential safety liabilities. If someone got hurt on that unauthorized footbridge, I could have been held responsible in some twisted scenario. The figure of $496,000 was our calculated estimate for everything from structural removal to potential restoration of the pond's edge, plus a margin for legal fees and emotional stress. During this period, I learned a few fascinating facts that further motivated me to pursue legal action. The HOA had used substandard wood for the bridge foundation. In an effort to reduce construction costs, they had purchased heavily discounted lumber that was prone to water damage. They tried to mask it with sealant. This choice could lead to rot in a matter of months if not maintained regularly. It also posed a possible safety hazard for anyone crossing over. They had misrepresented the pond to their community. In a series of newsletters, the HOA leadership boasted of exclusive access rights to a natural landmark, implying it belonged to the association members for events like fishing tournaments. They even scheduled a summertime family fishing day, encouraging children to bring rods and tackle. It was borderline fraudulent, since the pond was entirely on my private property. They were advertising access to land they did not own. The association never updated their own bylaws to reflect the existence of this alleged easement. If a valid easement existed, their bylaws should have mentioned it, especially as it would be a major highlight for community amenities. Yet, there was no mention of any pond or footbridge in their official documents from the last decade. They apparently planned a large community fundraiser on my property. I discovered that the HOA had advanced plans for a charity walk that would cross the footbridge and follow a path around my pond. They were even coordinating with local sponsors, selling tickets, and guaranteeing a scenic route. None of this was disclosed to me. They tried to obtain liability insurance for the footbridge that included coverage on my property. I received a letter from an insurance company stating they needed me to fill out a form verifying the details of the land. The association had incorrectly listed my property under their policy, which was a major legal error. Each of these revelations amplified my determination to take them to court and put a stop to the overreach. I realized that if I allowed them to continue, I would be entangled in more issues down the line, random events, neighbor disputes, and even possible injuries that might fall on my shoulders. When I officially filed the lawsuit, everything changed. The association board, which had previously ignored my demands, sprang into action. Their newly retained attorney reached out, trying to negotiate. At first, they offered to remove the footbridge if I would sign a limited easement, allowing them to occasionally host events by the pond. I declined. Then they offered a lump sum to buy the portion of land that included the pond. I found that insulting, as I purchased my property specifically for that feature. I turned them down again. The lawsuit progressed. We collected testimonies from neighbors who had seen the entire process of construction. Many were upset at the association board for pushing such a large project without thorough transparency. One neighbor even showed me an email thread in which the board ignored concerns about verifying the true ownership of the pond. Another recounted that she had questioned the potential legal ramifications, but the board had brushed her off. These testimonies formed a strong case against the association, showing that the board members intentionally pressed forward without proper diligence. In the meantime, my attorneys filed for a preliminary injunction to prevent the association from using the footbridge any further. This request was granted by a judge, so the HOA had to place a temporary closure sign on the structure. That did not stop a few residents from crossing it anyway, but legally, the association was barred from promoting or encouraging its use. We proceeded to the discovery phase, where both sides exchanged documents. The association's attorneys produced that same shaky agreement from 70 years ago, along with some older maps that did not clearly indicate a pond or any right-of-way. My legal team countered with updated county records, modern surveys, and the official deed to my property, which clearly stated that the pond lay entirely within my boundary lines. The judge overseeing the case expressed skepticism about the validity of that archaic document. As the lawsuit continued, tensions flared in the neighborhood. Several homeowners who lived in that development approached me personally, apologizing for the trouble and saying the board had never fully explained the situation to them. One older gentleman, who had lived there for over 20 years, mentioned that the board's pushy nature was new, likely sparked by some younger members who wanted more community amenities to boost property values. He even revealed that the new board president had told people that developing property around the pond would drive up the association's allure to prospective buyers. Days of depositions followed, with board members testifying. Some claimed they genuinely believed the pond was part of an old easement. Others admitted they had doubts, but were swept along by the majority. One especially frustrating piece of testimony came from the project manager, who confessed that they never had a professional boundary survey done. They'd relied on shared documents and an informal conversation with someone who was no longer on the board. My attorneys hammered home the point that they had acted recklessly, ignoring multiple warnings and forging ahead with construction. In the midst of all this, I discovered yet another troubling fact. The HOA had used funds earmarked for community safety improvements to pay for the footbridge construction. Their budget proposals had apparently disguised the project as a safety walkway, claiming it would reduce traffic in the streets by giving residents a direct path to the nature trail. This was baffling, as none of that matched reality. If they had asked me from the beginning, we might have reached a formal agreement or arrangement, but they chose the underhanded route. Months passed. My legal bills were mounting, but so were the HOAs. Some residents began pressuring the board to settle with me, especially once it became clear they had no solid defense. Every day, I received new bits of information that validated my grievances. The association's leadership was in hot water, and they knew it. Their attorney reached out again with various settlement offers, all of which were insufficient or conditional in ways I found unacceptable. For example, they wanted me to grant them future access or lower the claim amount if they could keep the bridge in place for exclusive use. I refused. They built on my property without my permission. They needed to remove the structure and pay for the damage they had done, both tangible and intangible. Finally, the court date arrived for the formal hearing. We laid out our case with clarity. We showed the judge indisputable evidence of my property lines. We demonstrated how the association had falsely claimed an ancient easement that was unsubstantiated. We presented photos of the unauthorized construction and the letters from the association's attorney dismissing my cease and desist. We highlighted how they'd begun promoting events on the property and financially benefited from the new amenity by showcasing it in marketing. The association's attorney tried a few tactics to defend them, including the claim that they acted in good faith. They also argued that it provided a community benefit, which they believed was important. But the judge was unmoved by those arguments. Good faith is not an excuse to trespass or build on private property without explicit permission, and public benefit is irrelevant if the land is privately owned and the owner never granted permission. At the end of the hearing, the judge made it clear that the HOA was in the wrong. The question of damages was paramount. My team had carefully documented the potential negative impacts on my property value, the legal fees, and the cost to restore the pond area to its previous state. The judge took all of that into consideration. Then, in a resounding decision, the judge ruled in my favor. While the final figure was slightly less than our initial request, it was still very close. The court awarded me a significant sum, enough to cover my legal expenses, restore any environmental disturbances, and reimburse me for the stress I had endured, along with providing me with a margin I felt was justified for all the trouble. The judge also imposed a strict order that the footbridge be dismantled immediately and the land be returned to its former condition. The HOA had to submit a detailed plan and timeline for removal, which the court approved, and they were to bear all the costs. There was an additional penalty for every day they failed to comply after the deadline. This was to ensure they did not simply let the structure sit there. As for the association leaders who orchestrated this fiasco, they faced significant backlash from their own community. Following the court's decision, a number of them resigned under pressure. Some neighbors told me that they were threatened with a separate legal action by the association's members, who were furious about the misuse of funds and the irresponsible decisions that led to the damaging lawsuit. In the end, I watched as a demolition crew arrived, removed the wooden planks, and hauled away every trace of the footbridge. The decorative lights were stripped from the pathway, leaving behind dirt patches. My attorneys oversaw the final inspection to confirm it was all done properly. Then, to further rectify the damage, the association funded a landscaping company I personally selected to replant the grass, stabilize the pond's edge with new brush, and ensure there was no hidden harm done to the ecosystem. During that time, a few members of that development approached me with heartfelt apologies. They confessed they felt duped by their own board. Many said they would learn from this and keep a closer watch on how their HOA allocated resources or claimed rights. Some neighbors reached out to me privately, hoping I wouldn't hold a grudge against them as individuals, which I didn't. I fully understood that most of the residents had no idea what was truly happening. They were only told by the board that the pond area was approved for community use. It was a lesson for everyone involved in how important it is to verify claims rather than simply trust a small group of individuals who may have their own agenda. As for me, although it was an exhausting battle, I felt relieved that justice prevailed. The monetary award helped offset the months of legal battles and the frustration I endured. More importantly, it set a clear precedent. My property was my own, and I would defend it when necessary. Had I done nothing, it could have escalated into more serious problems later. At one point, I even feared the HOA might try to expand the structure further or set up a permanent pavilion, attracting larger crowds. The lawsuit made it clear that no such encroachments would be tolerated. I can't say the process was pleasant. It was daunting to go up against an organized group with resources. However, I discovered that even an HOA is not beyond the reach of the law, especially when it acts recklessly and without evidence. It cost them both financially and in terms of reputation. Many homeowners in that neighborhood were outraged to learn their money had been spent on legal defense for a project that was never verified and was, in fact, an unauthorized intrusion onto private property. In the months that followed, my private pond returned to its peaceful state. The fish I had stocked were still there, unbothered. The old dock was mine to sit on in the early mornings, with only the sound of birds and the gentle sway of the water. Whenever I strolled that perimeter, I found some lingering signs of the project's presence, little scraps of wood or a stray nail in the grass. But each time, I made sure to dispose of them, tidying up the last remains of that ill-fated attempt at communal expansion. I also took steps to ensure no similar issues would arise. I posted signs that clearly stated, "Private property, no trespassing." My attorney advised that having visible signage is helpful if future disputes ever occur. Though I didn't want to fence the entire pond, I needed to protect myself legally. I also filed updated paperwork with the county to restate that no easements existed on that stretch of land. My boundary lines had been reaffirmed, and the local authorities were aware that the association next door had no rights to access. Interestingly, I did receive one more letter from the newly elected HOA board president sometime later. The tone was apologetic, and the letter stated that the previous administration had caused tremendous trouble and expense for both me and the residents of that community. The new president asked if I would be open to forging a better relationship with the HOA, perhaps even allowing them limited use of the pond for a carefully monitored event in the future. In return, they offered a formal agreement, potential payments, and a lot of disclaimers. My attorney advised me that such a decision was entirely up to me, but that I should have any agreement thoroughly documented if I ever considered it. At the time, I did not respond. I was still recovering from the ordeal and had no desire to revisit a partnership that had caused me so much grief. Every once in a while, I bump into some of the folks who live in that neighborhood when I'm at the local grocery store or the library. They're always polite, sometimes a bit embarrassed. A few tell me how they ousted some of the old board members, reorganized their HOA finances, and rewrote their bylaws to ensure nothing like this would happen again. One neighbor even joked that my lawsuit was the best thing that ever happened to them because it forced the community to start paying attention to where their dues were going. While I wouldn't wish such turmoil on anyone, I'm pleased they learned from it and made changes for the better. Looking back, I see how easily a situation can escalate if people assume they have the right to do something without verifying it. The association believed they had a 70-year-old easement, or so they claimed. They never checked thoroughly, never approached me in a respectful manner, and never heeded my warnings. In the end, they wound up in a huge legal mess. I remind myself that every step I took was necessary. If I had tried to handle it informally, I might have been taken advantage of or ended up responsible for accidents on that flimsy structure. Sometimes firm legal boundaries are the only language certain groups understand. It's been a while since I last saw anyone from the old board. I suspect they moved or quietly resumed their lives without the power they once wielded. There was talk of them facing additional consequences from their community, such as being required to reimburse the HOA for some of the legal costs. I heard rumors that the former board president was ostracized by neighbors for misleading them. One longtime resident told me that the board president had tried to deflect blame onto the contractor and claimed that the pond wasn't actually as private as I maintained. But the court documents disproved all of that. He eventually had to accept responsibility for signing off on a project that had no legal basis. Amid all this, I never lost sight of why I bought my property in the first place. For me, it was the freedom of not having to answer to an HOA and the peace of enjoying my own corner of nature. When you choose a home, you often do so for intangible reasons that revolve around comfort, security, and personal preference. My pond was my dream come true, somewhere to fish, relax, watch the sunset, and let the daily stress melt away. Having an unwanted structure built over it, having random people trample around, and dealing with the complexities of a lawsuit threatened that dream. But I held my ground. That dream was worth defending. In hindsight, I did take away a few lessons, some of which might be useful to anyone buying property or facing a dispute with a nearby homeowners association. Always keep immaculate records. If I hadn't saved all my surveys, deeds, and other documents, I might have had a harder time proving ownership. Keeping digital backups is also essential, in case physical copies get lost or damaged. Act promptly when you suspect wrongdoing. I should have acted more decisively the moment I saw the surveyors near my pond. Seeking an immediate injunction or verifying boundary lines can prevent unauthorized structures from going up in the first place. Stay calm, but be persistent. It can be infuriating when you see your rights being trampled. However, losing your temper or acting rashly can backfire. Careful legal counsel and a methodical approach are key in these matters. Communicate clearly with neighbors. Many of the HOA members were misguided by their board. If I had reached out earlier, some of them might have rallied against the project from the start. Though it's not my job to police the HOA's internal affairs, more open communication could have avoided a lot of trouble. Remember that you have recourse. HOAs, while they have certain powers within their communities, do not stand above the law. If they cross into your territory, literally or figuratively, you have legal options to protect your rights. The entire ordeal tested my patience and my financial resources. But in the end, I received a court-ordered judgment for the lawsuit, which amounted to a substantial portion of the $496,000 I initially sought. It was enough to cover every penny of my legal expenses and have a fair amount left to invest back into the property. I ended up installing better landscaping around the pond and upgraded my small dock. I also set aside a portion for a rainy day, because you never know when life decides to throw you another curveball. I still sometimes reflect on how quickly something that seemed impossible, like an HOA building a bridge across my private pond without permission, turned into reality. This underscores just how vigilant we all have to be about our rights. When local governance or community associations overstep, they might dress it up as a benefit to the greater good, hoping no one challenges them. But we, as individual property owners, must stand up for what is ours, especially when we know the law is on our side. Since the lawsuit concluded, life has gradually returned to a peaceful normalcy. The new HOA board doesn't bother me, and from what I can gather, they're much more careful in everything they do. Neighborhood newsletters mention respecting private property lines and caution residents not to trespass in areas not officially designated for public use. In its own quiet way, the fiasco might have improved the overall conduct of that association. Sometimes significant mistakes lead to lasting reforms, and I suspect that's what happened here. There was a time when I thought I might consider selling the property out of sheer frustration. But after winning the lawsuit, there was a renewed sense of attachment. The pond seemed even more precious to me, a symbol of my autonomy and willingness to stand firm. The fish were thriving, the vegetation around the water was lush, and every morning I woke up reminded me that this place was truly mine, legally and morally secured from outside meddling. Occasionally, I'll catch sight of a curious passerby peeking through the trees to see if that footbridge is still there. I imagine it must be jarring for them to realize the structure is gone. Some might still think the pond is part of their association's amenities, but I remain watchful. If I see anyone stepping onto my property, I calmly explain to them that this land is private. Thankfully, after the lawsuit, most folks understand. Sometimes they're a bit embarrassed and quickly leave. I harbor no ill will for casual passers-by who are just confused, but I take care to protect my boundaries, both for my own sake and to avoid future legal entanglements. All in all, the entire chapter taught me just how critical it is to know one's rights and be prepared to defend them. It's not about being combative or looking for a fight. It's about standing up for the principle that private property is private, and no group, no matter how large or influential within their own boundaries, can override what's rightfully yours. The legal system recognized the violation. The responsible parties faced punishment, both in court and within their own community. Their misdeeds led to a lesson they won't easily forget. If someone had told me years ago when I was first looking at this property that the biggest challenge to my enjoyment of it would come from a neighboring HOA building a structure across my pond, I would have laughed at how absurd that sounded. Yet real life is often stranger than fiction. Fortunately, I was able to find a resolution that asserted my ownership, compensated me for the trouble, and enforced the removal of their ill-gotten footbridge. Thank you for watching.